topical tafsirs. The idea of thematic unity is, I would liken it to an analogy, if you will. The saying, he can't see the forest for the trees. So when your point of view is very close, you're looking down at your feet to see where you're stepping, it's very different than if you somehow were to go up in an airplane. When I was a college dropout living in Olympia, Washington, I'd ridden all of those roads on my bicycle. And then one of my neighbors was an amateur pilot, and he invited me to go up with him on a plane ride, a single-engine Cessna, something like that. And we flew all over the city, and I saw all of the places that I had seen from ground level on a bike. I saw them from a new perspective up in the plane. And it was a whole different way of seeing what I had seen earlier at ground level. And if we look at fiqh, certainly the great fuqaha from among the Sahaba, the great example from among them all is Umar ibn al-Khattab. They definitely had that vision. They had the understanding of how all the parts related to the whole. And as time went on, it seems like that vision began to become less prominent. The awareness of the relationship between the whole and its parts. In fiqh, fairly early on, there was a process. A process got underway where the proliferation of detail in fiqh rulings made it so difficult for anybody to remember what the early leading scholars had said, that they went through it all and began to look for patterns by which to organize the material. And that led to what's called al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya and usul al-Fiqh, and then from there you get al-Maqasid, and the objectives, the higher objectives of the Sharia. And the person who really put all of that together in a very coherent theory was Imam al-Shatibi, who was roughly 9th century. I think he died near the end of the 800s Hijri. And I may be wrong in that. Maybe it's a full century before. I lose track. Anyway, he lived near the very end of the Muslim presence in Andalus. And he wrote his groundbreaking book on usul fiqh called al-Muwafaqat fi usul fiqh. And, it was a revolutionary approach. And one of his approaches was what's called istiqra, as a means of looking at the texts. In other words, generality. We talked in an earlier lecture about am wal khas, and we said that there are certain wordings that indicate generality. Shatibi said, well, there's a whole other way to derive generality from the text, and that is you see a rule in one text, you see a rule in another text, in another, and you see a whole spectrum of the same type of rule in many different areas of the Sharia. That gives you, if they're all bound together by a similar theme and idea, then the theme that binds them is general. And that generality has been developed by many specific instances. And so this is what you might call induction. And induction is the opposite of deduction in logic. Induction is the basis for the methodology of science. You have a case here and a case here and a case there. You can never exactly prove a scientific theory. You can disprove it by having a counterexample. But if you have like 100 examples that are in line with your theory, although you can't say, okay, the theory's been proved per se, having all of those examples begins to develop evidentiary weight. And so Shatibi really pioneered that attitude or that approach with regard to looking at the text for evidence. And although what happened, the Muslim world was in a sort of intellectual decline anyway when he did his groundbreaking work, and not very many people picked up on it. It was sort of, it lapsed into obscurity until basically maybe the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Al-Muwafaqat was published in Tunisia, I believe, and it so happened that Muhammad Abdu was visiting Tunisia, and he was introduced by the ulama of al-Zaytuna to this work of Shatibi, and he was impressed by it, took it back with him to Egypt. He didn't personally have the time to study it in great depth, but he felt it was important enough that he put one of his students, his gifted students, to editing the text and commenting on it. And that student, his name is Abdullah Draz. He was of Syrian origin. But he studied at Azhar, and I'm pretty sure he became a professor there as well. His son, Muhammad Draz, also an Azhar graduate, it's pretty obvious that he came up under, in that atmosphere of his father's absorption, and his father studying the Muwafaqat in great detail and absorbing that understanding. And of course he would have been talking about it with his son because they're in the same field. And so eventually Muhammad ibn Abdullah Draz, he goes to the Sorbonne for higher studies, and he did a PhD thesis on the Qur'an, a new look at the Qur'an, and he got like the top grade possible for it, and that was then published as النبأ العظيم نظرات جديدة في القرآن الكريم. النبأ العظيم means the tremendous tiding. نظرات جديدة, new ways of looking at or new theories about the Qur'an. And so his whole focus on that was, the Qur'an needs to be recognized as having internal coherence, thematic unity, and so that's the whole thrust of that book. Now, the book was written in French, and then I guess he translated it or rewrote it again in Arabic, and it was published in the 50s. And he has since passed away. I believe he died in the 70s, not sure. But one of the more recent translators of the Quran, M.A.S. Abdul Halim, who apparently is living and working in England, he has translated, if not An-Nabu al-Azim, he's translated something that was also closely related to Muhammad Daraz's PhD thesis. It's called, the English title is An Introduction to the Qur'an. And so he presents or let's say that it gives the English reader an opportunity to study Draz's thoughts and his thesis.